I mean, I always felt that it was much more, and this is very anecdotal, but I always felt that it was much more humiliating for the art historians to go and have to go into the studio and make work, which was one of the things that we had to do as part of our course of study, than for the artists come in and have to talk about, you know, Jacques Derrida or something. I mean, it just felt like we were put in a position of being made fools of, whereas they were put in a position of being elevated to, you know, knowledge or something.
Right.
And those kinds of prejudices, I think, are still really rampant also in what we call the art world. You know, who has the right to, who's in a more legitimate position to talk about certain kinds of visual artifacts or experiences of the artifacts. Unfortunately, I feel like that's still very much an issue.
Yeah. For me, I can also relate to that experience, since after leaving Columbia, my first job was at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, which is an art school, a practicing art school. So suddenly I was confronted with teaching artists the discourse of art history.
Which is what I do, and which is very, very different than teaching
absolutely
art history majors.
Yeah, it has its challenges and it has its joys in a way. It's very interesting, but maybe one interesting connection we can use here to go back to something else you brought up earlier, which is the status of contemporaneity, really, and which in a way might seem to displace or to demote the relevance of art history, since art history seems to be attached to the historical, right? This is, of course...
This has been a debate in October and in Influx magazine very recently.
Yeah, and you may be aware, but the discourse of art history in the UK is different from that in the States, in the sense that in the UK it's very accepted to write about contemporary art within art history. So that even at the level of doctoral dissertations, it's not a problem to take on a student who's doing a contemporary topic for a doctorate. That's common in the UK. In the States, that is not at all. It's, I think, still to this day, it's not accepted, and or very rarely accepted.
It's very problematic.
Yeah, I think it's starting to change in the States. But this is, I think, part of the whole explosion of interest in the contemporary that has occurred today. And for me, I experienced this moving suddenly from writing a dissertation on Duchamp, because it was understood that you couldn't write on contemporary art. You needed to do you needed to do a historical topic to guarantee your legitimacy as an art historian when you entered into the career path. To suddenly teaching in an art school where, you know, what is considered contemporary in an art history department might be, at that time at least, the 60s, might be considered contemporary. The 60s is ancient history in an art school context, and suddenly, like, being thrown into that is very interesting and invigorating in a way. And that's when I began, you know, writing as a critic more often, and my whole practice shifted at that point. And I think just another point, which has become evident to me, is the significance of the curator becoming, like, in a way, the most significant subject within contemporary art. Of course, there's the collector and auction houses and art fairs and biennials, but it's the curator who's the one who is, in a way, commissioned, at least certain kinds of curators. The new curator of contemporary art is, in a way, commissioned to travel. And that has become necessary after '89. One has to travel on research trips. The curatorial research trip has become a new institution within the curatorial school, which is also something new, the postgraduate MA curatorial school, and the marketing and institutionalization of curatorial education. So given these demands, these imperatives of having to travel to learn about contemporary art in Asia or in the Middle East or Africa or Latin America, the art historian simply does not have the resources. The art historian is not equipped institutionally to deal with that demand.
No.
So it makes sense, in a way, that the curator has displaced the art historian in relationship to, having being the mouthpiece for contemporary art discourse.
Or rendering certain things more visible than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And not through text, but through exhibition practice. I mean, there's the sort of concomitant shift away from the production of textual discourse to the production of a sort of experiential discourse within an exhibition that can either be authored by a curator or, the representation of a scene, or one in which it's mainly artist-driven or group-driven.
Yeah, but we could. I think.
And text becomes supplements, or at least to a certain extent, becomes supplements to the spatialization and visualization of knowledge.
Yeah. So I think we could formulate this as to say that the development of globalization after '89 and the way it's impacted the art world has rendered former art history as a discipline, in a way. And it's also rendered former Western art history. This is something else that, if we're talking about the discipline of art history, because today I think the discussion isn't so much about visual culture versus art history. It's art history, which is now, Euro-American art history. The universalizing assumption involved in art history has become singularized. So then now I think people would talk about Euro-American art history. That's now art history has rendered former as Euro-American art history, and the new tension is between that and world art studies. This is the new disciplinary development, for better or for worse. So there's been numerous recent books published on world art, which is to say that, and there's also been books written, like, for example, James Elkins has written edited volumes on is art history global? So these are new questions, I think, that fall into place in the post-'89 context.
Well, in some respects, it's very good that art history is asking itself these questions, although James Elkins occupies a very specific sort of pivotal role within the matrix of Anglo-American art history, being centered at an art school, which also is quite interesting, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, right? And his productivity is legendary. So on the one hand, it's really salutary that art history is maybe thinking in terms of world art studies. On the other hand, there still seems to be this, and this is purely a superficial reading, but there seems to be still a kind of drive to totalization, or a kind of an attempt to make different things fit into an already established narrative, historical trajectory, and so forth.
Yeah, that would be my problem with it as well. The projection of the term art onto, material heterogeneity. Going back to the beginning of historical time, I think is extremely problematic.
How are we doing? Half hour? Was that a half hour?
Nearly. Another 6 minutes if you want half an hour.
Let's see. Do I have any more questions? But I think we've covered everything that I jotted down for you.
One thing that I would, maybe thinking back, that I would add as a footnote is this relation between the post-colonial and the post-communist. For me, the inclusion of Oqui in the first former West Congress was very telling and interesting and provocative, because he brought out, he I think effectively problematized the premise of the former West research project in a very interesting way. And I realized that Congress was precisely about opening up questions. It wasn't about presenting a finished conceptualization of a research project. But I think for me that to open it up in that way was very provocative, and so I'm very curious about how this will play itself out.
And what specifically in Oqui's intervention struck you, as opposed to, say, Sarat Maharaj or Paul Gilroy's interventions, because all three were quite critical of the position that former West was starting from, from either the chronological origin, which I think we need to think of in terms of maybe in a Benjaminian sense of origin, or I hope rather than a chronologically strict origin.
Yeah.
That would take into account the flow that comes from before and the flow that comes after.
Yeah. No, I would add them. It's not just Oakley. It's you're right. It's Surratt and Paul Gilroy as well, and Oakley. Figures who have there's a lot of resonance between their work, and they've worked together on different projects. So so I think that is crucial. But Oakley's raising of the whole history of decolonization and trying to refocus the discussion on the question of the status of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Middle East and North Africa, and Europe's relationship, very important and problematic historical and contemporary relationship to Africa, resonated with me in relationship to that Congress, and I felt like that was that needs to operate in a way to reframe the question, I think, of the former West as a research project.
I think that's a good place to stop.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
It was enjoyable.
I'm glad you enjoyed that.